Joining us right now is former House Majority Leader and former Virginia Congressman Eric Cantor. Congressman, it's good to see you. Thanks very much for joining us, and we really want to get your take on this, being from Virginia. Your reaction?
Well, listen, Maria, very sensitive for me, from Virginia, and as someone of the Jewish faith. Obviously, the events that unfolded in Charlottesville this weekend were abhorrent. You know, the president did call out the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists and those who are supporting the likes of the KKK, and he should have just stopped there. Because that is where I think the majority of Americans are. We do not tolerate that. There shouldn't be any equivocating about that. And then when you go in and say there's blame on both sides, no. There is not equivalent blame. Sure, both sides engaged in violence and were armed and the rest, and that's horrible. But when you look at where white supremacy, neo-Nazism led to in the skirmish in Charlottesville, it led to an individual slamming a car into a crowd of protesters. That is domestic terrorism. That is what we cannot support, nor does any American, I think, law-abiding American.
You're right.
So, listen, all this is unfortunate, and I think what it's doing is it's hiding some of the good things that the president and his administration are trying to do to get this economy going again.
Congressman Cantor, how are you? It's Jack Brewer. Is this president just out of touch with race relations in this country? I mean, as I sit back and watch this, and I agree with a lot of the president's policies, but as a black man watching the reaction, particularly after he missed it on the first opportunity, is he that out of touch with the reality of race in America?
You know, I can't explain why the desire to go in and pick a fight about, you know, violence on both sides. I think that's a given. But I think there is a sensitivity that is not being met in terms of not only race relations, but those of us who are in minority religions, and you hear the epithets being hurled by the people in Charlottesville saying that Jews will not replace us. That's some serious stuff. And, you know, we have a Constitution that provides a special class of protection for those who are persecuted or discriminated against on the basis of religion or their race. And again, this gets to the core of who we are as a country. And I think irony that all this unfolded in the town of Thomas Jefferson. And so, again, I think that's why people are so exercised, and legitimately so.
I'm curious, as Lee Carter, the discipline of message that's required right now is something that we haven't seen in the Republican Party and the president since he's taken office. It doesn't seem like everybody's on the same page. This should be one thing that we can all get together on and say, this is not our party, this is not America, this is just simply wrong. And yet we're seeing this fracturing, people trying to distance themselves from the president, and all sides necessarily aren't coming together on this. How would you say that the party needs to come together and stand behind a single message, which hasn't seemed to be able to happen, whether you're talking about this, whether you're talking about tax reform, or talking about health care?
Well, listen, I mean, I don't think you can equate the issues of tax reform and health care with something like condemnation of neo-Nazis, KKK, and white supremacy. So I do think that there is collective agreement. The president himself called out those groups. I think where things have gone off into another direction is when the comments are being made to somehow say blame is on both sides at an equal level. Yes, there's violence on both sides that should be condemned, and both sides came armed, but one side came to protest the other.
Yeah.
The initial act of rejecting those who are different than the white majority in this country, I mean, that, again, that's what strikes to the core of our Constitution, and I think we can all sort of agree on that there's no place for that.
Yeah, I don't believe the president said it was equal blame, though, but, you know, I recognize that it's not the time, the moment here to discuss anything except the condemnation of the supremacists. But let me ask you, I think what Lee was hitting on was just the messaging, Eric, because the bottom line is the Republicans have had a really hard time communicating messages all on one page. So, yeah, while it's obviously completely different subjects, they can't seem to get a message across.
Well, listen, I mean, it's difficult given, Maria, as you know, the 24/7 information flow that has become so rapid, and it has empowered everyone in America, if not the world almost, and the countries that allow it, for people to get online and express their opinions. So very, very difficult. But I do think there's a common core in the Republican administration as well as those on Capitol Hill. They're trying to do the job to get the economy going, to get people back to work, to lift the sort of burden of the federal government and allow people to grow in this economy to get back on track.
And in that realm, let's talk about the news of the morning. Hope Hicks reportedly named White House Communications Director, replacing Anthony Scaramucci. According to the Daily Caller this morning, Hicks has been serving on the president's press team since the early days of the campaign, and it comes as Steve Bannon's tenure as White House Chief of Staff may be in question. President Trump making a lukewarm comments yesterday about Steve Bannon, what I found really revealing. Listen to this.
I like him. He's a good man. He is not a racist, I can tell you that. He's a good person. He actually gets a very unfair press in that regard. But we'll see what happens with Mr. Bannon.
We'll see what happens with Mr. Bannon. This amid reports that Bannon has fallen out of favor with the president. The last time we heard we'll see what happens, Congressman, it was about Reince Priebus. It was about Jim Comey. We'll see what happens. Typically leads to a firing. What do you think here?
You know, what I think is, you know, the president, those on Capitol Hill, I know they want to focus on the agenda at hand, and I know there's so much fascination on the part of the media about palace intrigue and the rest at the White House. Listen, the president's entitled to have the staff and the team that he needs to implement his agenda and to drive, you know, the direction of the country that he was elected to do. So I'm hopeful that we can begin to see them focus on getting tax reform done, hopefully being able to do something about health care, and so that, you know, the promises that have been made over the last decade by the Republican Party can be realized.
Yeah, and they continue to say that they're going to get this something on the president's desk by Thanksgiving. Eric, before you go, you're now at Moelis & Company. You're dealing with businesses all the time, so you've made this great pivot from politics to business. What's your take on all these business guys stepping off the council?
Listen, I mean, yeah, it's a tough question right now because, as you know, CEOs and other officers of the company, I mean, they have a fiduciary duty to shareholders, investors, or if the company's public, to the shareholders, and they've got to make a decision as to what's in the best interest of their shareholders. Certainly, there's a case to be made that a CEO should be at the table anytime the President of the United States calls to stick up for the company, its shareholders' interest. But there's another case to be made that if there is going to be a mass exodus on the part of a company's customers, clients, etc., then there needs to be some discussion. And I think that's what we're seeing in corporate boardrooms around the country right now in taking stock of what's happened over the last couple of days.
All right, Eric Cantor, great to have your insights. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Appreciate it.
We'll see you